Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It's good to be with you again today. Today, I will be joined by a friend of the show, um, Alejandro Villalpando, and we're going to talk about a whole bunch of stuff. Um, this is a conversation, again, that kind of my own way of building on the work that was done at the Archives Unbound conference. Um, and I should say that one of the things that we'll play is a part of the panel that Fred Moten and Stefano Harney were a part of. And I talked to them about it and wanted to do a discussion with them about friendship and cells, and they were really open to it, and unfortunately we just didn't weren't able to make it happen. And it's just the challenges of being at the conference and all the stuff that was going on and off, on and inside and outside of the conference spaces and stuff like that. And maybe we will be able to make that happen at some point. They were definitely open to it. Um, but I think that what we can do is have a little bit of a reflection and conversation about it here ourselves. Good morning, Nadir. Good morning, Eric. Good to see you both. And so we'll talk about a lot. And so I'm going to start and just get into it because there's a number of clips that we're going to play today. And then Alex and I are going to offer reflections on the clips, but also just about other things. But we'll start with one from Cedric Robinson. So this one I think is important to play because Fred Moten's piece is actually responding in part to what Cedric Robinson was saying here. His comes in 2004, which was the 20th anniversary of Black Marxism, which was a very, no, 20th, yeah, 20th, which was a big conference, and it kind of actually there were some reflections on it 20 years later at the conference that we were at. A couple weeks, a few weeks ago now. And we'll play a little bit of that as well. With all of this, we're not going to play full length stuff because there's just a lot and we want to be able to talk about it a little bit. And some of the conversations, hopefully, we'll have more expanded versions of. On Monday, we will have HLT Kwan. And so, for instance, she's part of one of the panels, but I did not going to play her portion of the panel today just because we'll be able to have a fuller conversation with her on Monday. Also, all of that stuff is up, so people can go. There's links in the show description where you can watch the full videos, the full panels, and I recommend people do that. But these are just kind of some highlights and some moments that offer us space for more reflection. So with that said, we'll start with Cedric Robinson here.
Last night, many of you saw a film called Devil in a Blue Dress, and there was a rather substantial discussion about Mouse after the film. And the terrible Pigeon whispered to me, because he refuses to speak in public. The terrible Pigeon whispered to me that he's a metaphor. He says, he's a metaphor. Right? And I thought about the terrible Pigeon's insights, and I've been teaching film for several years, and every time you see the film, you see something new in the film. There were 4 violent black males in that film, Devil in a Blue Dress. I don't have time for those who didn't see the film this time, but maybe you've seen it before. 2 of them were mercenaries, the watermelon-headed brother who both smoked the zapatas, and Joppy, the barman who had such pride in his marble top. The other 2 violent men were Frank Green, the brother of Daphne, and Mouse. And as Otis indicated last night, In the novel, there's a total construction for Frank Green. He is the brother or half-brother of a sister who has been sexually abused by her father. His violence is protective of her. All right. So it has a germination. It has an explication. Mouse is the only one for whom there is no explanation for his violence. So the terrible Peugeot is probably right, that even in Mosley's construction, Mouse was more metaphor, right, than character. Stretching that, Mouse, his violence is married to, as part of the pillar of a complement to, a condition of possibility for the achievement, fulfillment, realization of the black petty bourgeois desire of easy rollings. Without Mouse, no house. All right? Without Mouse, no neighborhood. All right? And the genius of the black petty bourgeoisie is to be able to administer and manage that violence. And when Easy asked Odell at the end of the film, what do you do when you have a friend that does really bad things? Right? Can you still be a friend? And Odell says, all you got is your friends. All you got is your friends. Iraq is Mouse. All right? Iraq is America's Mouse. American radicalism's Mouse. Remember the first powerful confrontation with race in the 19th century that was positive was the Civil War. All right? That is, we know that one thing was happening in the 1850s and perhaps the 1840s, but certainly the 1850s, the abolitionists were winning the propaganda war. The abolitionists outproduced the pro-slavery faction in terms of pamphlets, even in terms of cultural materials like plays and novels, et cetera, et cetera. The most, produced and reproduced play of the 19th century was Uncle Tom's Cabin, isn't it? Right? So the abolitionists won that contest outright. The realization of the abolitionist desire came with the admission of violence. All right? That is the war. That is 190,000, 200,000, primarily slaves serving in the Union Army and the Union Navy. Just think about that. Think about that. Between 1863 and 1865, nearly 200,000 mostly slaves, trained and fought and turned the Union defeat into victory, accounting for 19% of the casualties of the Union Army. All right? That was the abolitionist's Mouse. All right. So we come to the 20th century, we come to the post-World War II period, we come to a moment when, in fact, like this moment, there was not a drift, but in fact, almost a tidal wave towards the right, in the direction of this extraordinary repressive society. And the thing which stopped it didn't halt it, but the thing which slowed it down and began to reverse it was, in effect, this violent confrontation called the Civil Rights Movement. All right? That is, people who said to themselves, I don't want to do this anymore. Kill me. I'm not going to do that anymore. All right? And so folks took them literally and killed some of them. Said, if you don't want to do it, that's okay, right? We'll find somebody else to do it. All right? So understand, my understanding of your question, Howard, is at this moment, how does it happen? It happens, as I was suggesting, with some sort of violent opposition. And at the moment, the violent opposition to America, right, is in large measure outside the United States. But we know that this is the kind of adventure which seems to be boundless. In the American military establishment, is going to have a simple resolution. They can determine that they won the war and leave, no matter what the realities on the ground are. They can proceed to genocide and have a resolution, or they can fight for another 15 years. All right. They told Reagan, we will only go to war if we can win in 2 weeks. Because you can't guarantee American public support for any longer period than that. That's what they told him. All right? And we've seen the deterioration of this policy already. So I think we can't avoid that reality. There are going to be, we can't afford to continue to lie to ourselves, right? That we can move out of this process by process, right? The resources are arranged against us, right? Many of us involved in the anti-war movement, and it was 8 months before the American media reported on it. A year and a half before, the prominent American media said, we're sorry we paid no attention to you. That was wrong. You were news. All right? So that gives you some sense of kind of stuff. So we have to win the propaganda war. That's a given. And some of you were talking this afternoon about the ways in which that can be done. But I'm afraid that easy victory we thought was possible through a Democratic Party takeover of the state. There's not enough in the Democratic Party, as far as I'm concerned, to warrant that kind of faith. All right? I hope that those of you who feel more optimistic are right. You know, I hope that you're right. But I've, seen a lot of bad things in my time. And I don't want to, I just don't want to close my eyes and say, they're not real. An alternative America is more real. I don't know about that.
All right. First, I'll just say that's an incredible, 10 minutes from Cedric Robinson right there. There's so much. We could just spend the whole episode talking about that. But I'm going to table our comments on that for a minute. I've taken notes, and I'm sure Alex has thoughts as well. And then I'm going to play next. I'm going to play Fred Moten's discussion, which, again, this was a couple weeks ago. This is based upon writings that Fred and Stefano put together in the book All Incomplete, which I'll say too, at that I actually got to see the moment where Stefano Harney handed Elizabeth Robinson, what do you call it? Signed, but also, there was some writing, right, that Fred and Stefano left for her, and of course, All Incomplete is a tribute to Cedric Robinson, at least, well, in many ways, but in the name, which comes from Terms of Order. So anyways, this is a piece that they work on in All Incomplete that then Fred is presenting a portion of, and Stefano has a portion too, but I actually do cut that, which I don't feel great about, but it's sort of on a slightly different topic, and a topic we'll probably go into on another time, but this one is much more topical to Devil in a Blue Dress and Cedric's thoughts there. So
Our talk is called All You Got Is Your Friends. Cedric's 2004 retirement celebration and conference began with a gathering at which we were invited to watch and discuss the 1995 film Devil in a Blue Dress, adapted from the first of the Easy Rollins mystery novels written by Walter Mosley, directed by Carl Franklin, starring Denzel Washington and featuring Jennifer Beals and perhaps most memorably Don Cheadle in the role of Mouse, a compact dynamo of Texas street muscle, whom Denzel's Easy calls up from Houston to be at his back as he negotiates the inter and intraracial perils of Black life in Los Angeles immediately after World War II. Cedric offered some brief remarks after the film in which he asked those of us attending to consider the absolute necessity of a figure like Mouse to the work of surviving and abolishing the racial regimes that buttress and renew racial capitalism. Since that evening, Stefano and I have happily been working on the assignment, which is more of a gift, an opportunity to continue to gather with him and with Elizabeth and with all their friends and study. This morning, we want to offer a brief report on our progress. We've been thinking especially hard about the closing of the film when Easy and his friend Deacon Odell, played by Albert Hall, contemplate the moral and or ethical problems the story leaves with them and us. Sitting on Easy's porch after resolving the questions surrounding Daphne Monet, the film's title character, and after a string of increasingly deadly encounters in which Mouse, with certain and mortal swiftness, saves both her and Denzel from their braided attempts to negotiate with the agents of American white supremacist terror. From politicians to businessmen to philanthropists to foremen to cops to gangsters to hipsters, all of whom at some point present themselves as friends of the Negro. House proud Easy, watering his plants at his house on his momentarily idyllic street, asks Odell if it's right to have a friend like Mouse, a friend who you know does bad things, a friend who's ready and willing and happy to kill anybody, anything, or for that matter, any concept, any assumption, any image that messes with either him or his friends. Odell, who's a church-going man and who therefore would know about these things, answers, all you got is your friends. There's something we say sometimes in echo of Zora Neale Hurston in her prior rendition of The Porch as a privileged site of Black study, when Janie, as she begins to recount her story, says to Phoebe, my tongue is in my friend's mouth. Of course, such a formulation, which blurs the distinction between the literal and the figural, also blurs the boundaries that in turn set up the relations between bodies or persons, thereby causing things in relation insofar as the thing must be in relation to tremble a bit in the certainty in which we place them or in their own self-certainty. In this regard, we can ask whether friendship, which is neither subjective nor interpersonal, but ontological, where all you got folds into all you are, operates outside of the metaphysical foundations or terms of order that is said to govern it, thereby confining it to the realm of politics. Friendship, whose pronouns are they, them, is and or are, in this regard, a practice, not a condition, an ontological totality that is preserved militantly, violently, annihilatively, as Erica Edwards said yesterday, as Mouse repeatedly shows and ethically proves in the film, always to Easy's relief and sometimes to his moral consternation. This tonal and percussive and just generally musical and vibratory practice that appears to oscillate between being and having disrupts, exceeds, and surrounds the morality of ownership and control that Easy bears. Insofar as it is sharing, friendship takes lives in the name of life. Friendship leaves home at a moment's notice, making a preferential option for the very displacement that it resists. It embraces the selflessness that is imposed upon it, ruthlessly innovating whatever forms that imposition takes. Friendship is violently experimental in this regard, and it might even be said to embrace the spontaneism that is often directed at it as a kind of slur of normative, moral, and practical reasoning. Improper, inappropriate, inappropriable, friendship is a kind of practice of privation, lived as wealth in the refusal of privacy. In this regard, if friendship is instantiated in the figure of Mouse, it also exceeds that figure and becomes a force whose modalities of violence are thoughtful as well as active. Your friend is the one who sits on your porch and lets you know that all you are is more than you and more than what you got. Your friend fucks you up for the sake of your preservation. The ethics of mutual aid dictates that you do the same in return. In this regard, friendship is not just all you got and all you are. It is also, in Cedric's terms, all incomplete. Friendship subsists as a general incompleteness. This comes into relief against the backdrop of Mouse, so that in this regard, Mouse is less of a figure and more of a force or field of anthographic dispossession. Mouse is a material and anarchic principle of the obscurity and chaos that, as Cedric says in Forgeries of Memory and Meaning, threatens both normative historical research and the structures of dominance they engender, and which persist under the guise of our critique and our dissent or our best moral intentions. So that it's not so much that Devil in a Blue Dress escapes the innovations of American cinema's racial regimes that emerged at the turn of the 21st century. It's just that even within a studio-funded and controlled Black cinema, obscurity and chaos can be nurtured for a minute and released into further study. So that every time we watch the film, we watch it with Cedric and Elizabeth, who remain our Mouse and our Odell, who model for us the necessary violence of radical thought, which moves past questions of individual morality into the practice of ethical sociality. We want to begin to think about with you at this very moment in this very messed up world is the relationship of the Mouse force, of the general badness. What's that relationship to spontaneism? Is there a natural history of the Mouse force? Do its opaque manifestations operate something like the reemergent spring of the general strike that Rosa Luxemburg talks about? Or the incalculable rhythm of the woman's club, which Du Bois discusses in his Quantum Sociology? How do we defend and advance and embrace violent reaction to underlying brutality when it erupts in Palestine or in the spooky, distant, non-local, and reiterative practices of the general camp as it breaks out in tented hives all over the settler university's rapacious, gluttonous body? Violence must be recognized in friendship as friendship and preserved. Mouse kills with love. Odell lovingly criticizes. They preserve the incompleteness of the ontological totality.
All right. So again, I encourage people to watch that whole clip. Alex, good to see you, man.
What up, man? Sorry for the messy background and shit, but this is how we live. The violence of entropy, being an academic, you know. But what's up? Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, man. Okay, so we'll get into this. So Colin asks, I am very unclear as to what the Mouse Force is. So that's a good place actually kind of to start, because I think for folks who haven't seen Devil in a Blue Dress, also they might not necessarily be able to put everything together. So or haven't seen it in a while. So Mouse is a figure is basically just pure violence. I mean, he comes in Devil in the Blue Dress. So the main character is played by Denzel Washington. His name's Easy Rollins. He's a vet who moved to LA after World War II and loses his job and gets pulled into basically being a private detective, although that's initially he doesn't go into it that way. He's just trying to get some money, and he gets offered some money to go find this woman who he thinks is white at the beginning, but it turns out that she's the daughter of what is described in the film as a Creole woman and a white man. And so she's a person of color, right? But navigating kind of, I mean, LA wasn't segregated under like legal segregation, but it is in this era, right, um, of segregation, and that stuff shows up in the film. And Easy is kind of navigating these different worlds of like this white underworld, politicians, um, and the black community, right? And I think the thing to say about Mouse is that Easy calls Mouse when he gets to the point where he knows he needs violence, when he gets to the point where he knows that he can't he's not going to be able to just sort of solve this mystery and resolve it without violence, and violence that acts. The thing about Mouse as a character for me is that he doesn't put much thought into his violence. Right? It's just raw, right? And so he'll just walk into a room and shoot somebody or look at somebody, or somebody says or does something slightly wrong, and he'll just pull his gun out and shoot them. There's even a scene at the end where Easy had asked him to like tie someone up, and they go back at the end and the guy's dead, and Easy's like, "What happened?" And he said, "Well, you told me not to shoot him." He said, "I choked him." So why did you do that? He said, "Well, if I'm here dealing with this, how am I going to be where you are to save you?" Basically. And so it's also this totally necessary thing, right? That Easy's not comfortable with all the time, but knows that he needs, right? And so then as you think about Cedric talking about it and Fred talking about it, he's talking about let's start with Cedric. Maybe he's talking about that movements change. There's always this violent force, and we may be uncomfortable with it. We may not know totally how to rationalize it, or to, may not be comfortable saying like this is us. But it's this kind of condition, this necessary condition through which change in the world actually occurs. And so yeah, I can start there. I don't know if you have thoughts you want to add up front.
I mean, just I started rewatching the film last night and was watching a little bit more this morning. And man, it's been a long time. It's like that White Man Can't Jump era. It was like that whole time of these films. But what struck me, just as it begins, right? Like it's so familiar to me, right? Like these communities, like the house that he drives up, when he pulls up in the driveway, and he's like, I just like pulling up in the driveway, right? And then there's a gardener, right? Like who's talking about some trees, right? Like, but that's that Black sociality that South Central had, right? And continues to have in different ways, but that is constantly being battled, right? And so I think, my experience with those things of friendship and building community, right? Like I think that those are really central forces, right? And because we live in this systemically abandoned, right, institutionally neglected, but also like historically targeted sector of Los Angeles, right, in South Central, there's this kind of there's been an assault, right, on that fabric, on that connection, right? But the need to be connected continues to remain. And that's what's always really interesting, right? But because of all those kind of structural things that I talked about, those historic things, those institutionalized things, there's just a lot of violence out here, you know, like there's the violence that is systemic, that is brought upon the people, right? Like, you know, and I think that one thing that is useful for folks to understand in movements, but also in academia, right, is that violence is so much more expansive than the one-to-one, right? Like the choking of someone or shooting someone, right? Like I think of the institutionalized violences in my community that kind of you know, it's still like the everyday shit, right? So for example, there's these little ass streets, you know, in a neighborhood, like I mean, I'm sure everyone can see this LA had and shit. We still high out here, you know. I'm right down the street from this Kendrick show and this pop out, right? Like there was fools on that stage last night that's from the neighborhood in my area. You know, I got phone calls like last night after the show saying like, you seen such and such up there, you know? And it was like amazing, right? But what I thought about was, you know, one of the things that I think about is this, there's these narrow ass streets in that community, right? Like where I grew up, narrow as fuck. And trash day is both sides. And so people push their trash cans to the middle. So because we're neglected, because rent is hella high, right? Like you have multi-unit, you know, like multi-family living situations, multi-generational, et cetera, et cetera. So then you have, this is a car city. So you got a gang of cars, right? Like for the people that can't afford to have a car. So then what you have is like on trash day, this accumulation of tension, of stress, of, you know, all these different things, right? That can easily, like, it's a real lo-fi solution. You pick one side up on one day and then you pick the other side on the other one. But what happens is this fucks up the parking in the neighborhood. People are really stressed. And this is where you get these like massive tensions of violence amongst each other, right? So how do you mediate shit like that? Well, you have to be in relationship with your neighbors. You have to be friends with your neighbors. You have to be able to fucking do what Cedric Robinson said, or what Fred Moten was saying, right? Like towards the end, I caught the end right now of that thing. I was live at that place, so it was nice just to hear the end, right? Like that friendship has to make room, or a community has to make room for violence. Oh fuck! Hold on,
You're good.
my bad. My dad is just calling me and shit. I gotta call him back in a little bit. But you know, you gotta make room for that violence, right? But you also have to make room to call it in, right? Like to kind of you have to have a relationship to be able to kind of like check it before it advances to like our own destruction in our communities, right? And so that to me is like the essence of how you take these kind of abstract notions of friendships and sales, like when we talk about them, or like when the brother who's going to speak about, you know, the Palestinian context, right? Is that's the next step, right? Is that how do you kind of how do you, man, he's throwing me off.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, let me get this call real quick.
You get it, and I have some things to say, so go ahead. Yeah. All right, cool. So while he's doing that, I'll just add a few other things. One, Cedric Robinson says a rock is mouse, right? So this is 2004. It'd be very interesting to talk about Cedric and his reflections on that era. But my reflections on that era are that it's interesting. He also says it's American radicalism's mouse, right? So I read that as him saying that this war, right, and the violence. I don't think he's just talking about the imperial violence, right? He also, and this maybe we'll talk to HLT Quan about this on Monday, but he makes a distinction between brutality and violence, and he doesn't actually see violence as a bad thing. He sees brutality as the bad thing, right? I think that's right. But so we might, when Cedric talks about violence and talks about mouse, it's actually more what we would talk about as like counter violence within Fanon, right? But the point being is Cedric is saying that the precondition of the war was there, right? And then we in the US radicalism, right? He's saying we have to win the propaganda war. And then he's very concerned about one thing, right? How much faith people have in the Democratic Party. Right. And I think that was absolutely prescient, and I think it's even more true today, right? Anyone who thinks, and so Fred in his commentary, Fred Moten, he talks about Palestine, right? Thinking with the mouse force, right? Which we're gonna go in a minute to some comments from Abdul Jawad talking about cells and friendship. Um, but I think that, so if you think about the counter violence against U.S. hegemony, right? He talks about the general strike, Du Bois, 200, enslaved Africans rising up against the Confederacy, joining the Union Army, right? So he talks about that, and then he talks about, um, and I should say, yesterday was Juneteenth, and I didn't say that yesterday, and I should have said that, but that's a great his commentary there on the general strike in those few sentences is wonderful. And he talks about the civil rights movement as a violent confrontation too, right? So again, he's talking about um, the counter violence, but even in that instance, he's like, it's just people saying we're not going to do this shit anymore, and you're going to have to kill us, and some people being like, all right, you know. And so again, like there's a lot of, he's not I in this discussion, I don't see him thinking about the figure of Mouse 2 as like intercommunal violence, even though Mouse does kill other black folks within the film. But there's sort of are these specific reasons why that he does that in order to pursue in order to go after the real evil, basically, in the situation. Um, and it's interesting too. I mean, I'm not going to go deeply into this today, but he talks about the black bourgeoisie as the regulators of Mouse, right? He talks about Easy as sort of the one with the petty bourgeois aspirations within the film. He's the homeowner, and there's a lot made out of that in the film, that he's a black homeowner, which is not typical, and that's made a point in the film too. Um, so there's that. So yeah, I wanted to say that. I wanted to bring up Cedric's note on the Democrats, Cedric's note on Iraq as Mouse, and Fred making that connection of Palestine to Mouse. So like part of this to me is just saying like, okay, we're in this moment again now where Palestine is the resistance in Palestine, right? It's why I think it's important to also name the resistance and not just talk about genocide, right? But actually acknowledge that there are forces resisting what is going on, and regardless of what you think about them, right? Again, like think about Mouse. Easy is friends with Mouse, but he even asks Odell at the end of the film, which Cedric references, what do you do when your friends do bad things, really bad things, right? And like that's is Cedric saying like, and Odell's response is all you got is your friends. But what Cedric is saying is that it doesn't matter, honestly, like what you feel about how uneasy you might be about that violence. It's still necessary in terms of this counterforce. Um, and so anyways, I just wanted to share some of that. I'm sorry, I know you got cut off, man. If there's anything else you wanted to add on to what you're saying.
I just wanted to finish this thought, like to mobilize, right? Like afterwards, right? Like you have to build these relationships, and people have to believe and trust in you. They have to see you, they have to feel you, they have to smell you, right? Like ain't nobody gonna die for you if you ain't living for them, Like, and I think that that's ultimately a really important thing to kind of build movements and cells and cadres to be able to withstand the inevitable violence, the perpetual violence, right? Like, because there's the stuff that I just talked about this everyday systemic shit that ends up building into this intracommunal violence, right? Building friendship, solidarity around like shared understanding, but also just shared humanity, right? Like when we live in under conditions of constant in human conditions, but also in conditions of where there's these thoughts of our own almost inhumanity, right? Like even when people talk about this, right? Like I've talked about this on the show before, right? But like, you know, this sector where I live in, right, like has been referred to by the LA Times and LAPD as Death Alley, right? And so that shit conjures up all kinds of things, right? And those are real, you know, like people be shooting and shit, like motherfuckers get shot out here, you know, like, and people get robbed and, you know, stuff like that does happen, right? But I never look at, I don't know. It is complex, right? Like it's complex because if you lose your child or your loved one or your neighbor, or your mother, your son, you know, like your daughter to like this violence, it's tough, right? But like you kind of accept it. I mean, you don't accept it, but it's just the reality because it's kind of the air that we breathe, right? And it's how do you then like not demonize or pathologize violence when it's a necessary tool or a necessary aspect to changing the conditions that fuck us up. You know what I mean? Like, and I think that that's a really a big thing, you know, and I see it all the time, you know, that sociality and shit, like, is really important, you know, like, that's why last night when people were watching that show, you know, like, from the outside, they were saying, like, you know, the jokes got off and, you know, those shits were hilarious, right? But also locally, you know, like I said, like, we was getting phone calls and, like, you see who was up there, you know, and so, like, immediately around our circles, we were like, man, stay home tonight because these gang units are going to be out in full force. And why? Because friendship is terrifying. Because unity and solidarity and good times is fucking terrifying, right? And this is outside of this kind of like neoliberal pop fucking intellectual shit of like resting as revolution or whatever the fuck people be branding themselves as, you know, like, I mean, I think that shit is important, right? But it's whittled down to nothingness, right? Like it's whittled down to like empty fucking signifiers, you know what I mean? Like just, oh, I took a nap, so therefore, you know, like the conditions in my fucking community are gonna change, you know, like that's not how that shit works, bro. But then, yeah, a nap can help you fight and build these relationships, right? Like, you know, like you may need that, right? Like I need a nap right now, you know what I mean? But like, you know what I mean? Like that's not the end all, right? And so I think that building these relationships and the wretched, right, of South Central or the wretched of Philadelphia or the wretched of New Orleans, right? Like they kind of understand this kind of penchant, you know, this penchant that the state has for violence, right? But also that violence is a real and ready tool, right? Like to be deployed at any given moment. And like Jared said, you know, it makes people uncomfortable and it's also unpredictable. And how do you fucking like build solidarity and movement around that connection to kind of wield this thing collectively, you know, or like wield for folks to wield these things collectively. You got to respect them and not like demonize and pathologize that, you know, and yeah, it's just, I really like this conversation. And I like everything about this comment, as you know, like, I mean, Jared and I, you know, go back a couple years and a couple, you know, instances and shit. And, yeah, in our conversations, this is part of it, right? Like, and it reminds you of that meme that floats around from Flight of the Conchords. So you want the systemic change, whatever the quote is, right? Like, but so by magic,
right?
Like that's what people want. They want shit to change by magic, and I don't know, man. Magic has sparks. You know what I mean? Right. So, but yeah, those are some
yeah. Yeah, and I think also just to lean on Cedric there, like he's not even saying like what we all need to do is become Mouse, right? And that's also not what Moten is saying, right? They're saying like how do we defend, be in better relation with, and not turn our backs on Mouse or you know, and again in this context, I don't think that there's no, to me, fetishization of violence within what they're saying. They're not trying to place some kind of positive value judgment on it. They're saying that for these large changes, like it, as you said, like the Flight of the Conchords meme, for people who don't know what it is, something along the lines of, yeah, I want total revolution and everything to change for the better so we can have an egalitarian society, but as long as there's no violence involved. And the guy's like, so by magic, right? And so anyways, that's the meme. But so from here, let's go to Abdul Jawad Omar, because I think this will help people think a little bit differently about this also. the context, this is from an episode I did with him a while ago. It's called "The Making of Palestinian Resistance," and as folks will see, this was actually not a prepared question for him. It's just something that kind of came up in the conversation, um, to talk about, because he talks about friendship in his work, and for a lot of us, that might be a strange place. Like if we're into these traditions of kind of secular political organizing where it's supposed to be based upon shared political beliefs and shared ideology and things like that, right? That's we're often sort of told. Um, then this could be, or a shared subject position, right? Like class or something like that. And so this is kind of a different take on that a little bit. Can you talk a little bit more, because I think you've mentioned something, we probably have talked about it a bit before in some of our conversations. It's funny, you know, after I post these live streams with Abdul Jawad, we usually talk for about an hour or so off air, and so that blurs in my mind what we've talked about on and off air. But one of the things that um, you've discussed is this development of cells, and I know we talked about this in one of our conversations earlier about your work around friendship and and kinship and cells. Obviously, also there's questions around um, that people might have, right? Of, as you said, like you could have the disciplined organization, you could have a disciplined army. I'm interested in what you think are some of the different dynamics that start to see the development of cells, and how you read that shift or that desire to sort of go that route rather than, for instance, joining some organization, and I guess in some ways give people a little bit of maybe an idea of how do cells then get activated or become involved, or how does that usually work?
I mean, look, there's no one way or entry into, there's no one way for people to enter into a cell. But I think for me, because what part of my research was, talking to dozens of ex-fighters and then, trying to like, it's not a view from what organizations say about themselves. Like, it's not what Hamas declares, for instance, in its official history, or what Fatah talks about when it talks about its own political history, or what PFLP also talks about. So I was sitting with people and talking to them, and generally people tend to, of course, exaggerate their own importance and self-importance in anything. And generally people also tend to indirectly tell you a lot without knowing that they're telling you a lot. And through the research, I didn't go into it thinking that friendship is central. I didn't, think that, I'll reach a conclusion that, I need to write a whole chapter on friendship and Palestinian resistance. But then I discovered that it's one of, it's if the, it's one of the central institutions of resistance, that it's one of the central building blocks of Palestinian resistance, historically speaking, not only in the first or second intifada, but throughout, and even until today, even in how the Palestinian resistance, as an organized, guerrilla movement that has different roles and has technologies and, building, it's still, friendship is a central component of all of this. Why is friendship a central component? Because the price of political action in Palestine, specifically if one is not, wedded to, a lone attack, somebody just doing attack by himself, is high. It's life in prison, or it's, being killed. And that's always been the case. Even now, it's even higher. For the West Bank, if you do an attack, now not only do you, Israeli soldiers will execute you, not only will they steal your body and put it in a freezer in Abu Kabir or bury it somewhere in Numbers Cemetery, but they will also destroy your family's home, who had nothing to do with what you did, And at the same time, they will, arrest your mother, arrest your father, humiliate your family in many instances, etc. So there's a price to be exacted even from your immediate social environment. But beyond that point, because the price is so high, people generally tended to only do actions with people they trust. And generally speaking, people who you trust are, the friends that you know, or the brother that you have, or your cousin, or your childhood buddy that you grew up with, and there's this kind of emotional, intense commitment to each other and affirmation of friendship throughout time. So in many instances, in the development of Palestinian resistance, friendship, either through kinship or close relationships, tying people together, becomes a way of recruitment, of expansion of military organizations, but also of the buildup of cells, even cells that are not tied to organizations. And that's why it's not surprising, for instance, for anybody who's arrested by the Israelis, perhaps the first question a self-respecting Israeli interrogator will ask you is, are you married or not? And the second is, who are your friends? These are the first things that he wants to know, because even within Israeli counterinsurgency outlook, generally speaking, even after, for example, this lone wolf phenomena in 2015, one of the lessons that they published was that we need to monitor the friends, because now what was happening, friends were not doing actions together, but we're following each other. So one friend does an action, then you see another friend following him and doing an action as well. So they started to tie even these lone wolf phenomena attacks with friendship, friends imitating or building some sort of mimicry towards each other, and then conducting attacks in succession rather than together. So they start surveilling. If anybody's killed, they start surveilling his kinship group, his friendship, and all his relationships. So again, just to look back of it, so friendship from that point of view was central because it's a high price, and for Palestinians to be able to do collective action together where they're certain that the other will not betray them, or the other will not tell on them, or the other will be committed as much as them, then it came out of this kind of sociality of the intimacy of being together and knowing each other very well. And as I said earlier, as this social densification process happens, as this interminable line or indeterminable line crisscrosses Palestinian society, separating them between a more active resistance part and the less active, supportive perhaps of resistance, but also sometimes, unwilling to go all the way. Most people who coalesced around resistance in the 1990s were coalescing around these small cells that were figuring out forms of action together, that were buying weapons together, that in many instances, a lot of cases, would only associate themselves with a political organization after they committed, acts of resistance. So, somebody like Fatah, he would say, I'm Fatah, and then go to prison as a Fatah member, or, something like that, but not necessarily always organized by a centralized hierarchical force that, organizations tend to, present as such. Specifically in that period, and even in the Second Intifada, and until today, though, in the West Bank, that's mostly the case, in the sense that people try to figure out ways through their kinship groups and through their friends to defy the Israeli military and the settler presence in Palestine. And that took me towards also thinking what friendship is. And it also took me to another way of also explaining perhaps also what happens when friendship fails. In these cells, what happens when it breaks down, when people fail to affirm their friendship, when they confess on each other, or when they have a trauma. I think for many of the resistance fighters I met, what hurt was not the torture in Israeli prison, or the isolation. What really hurt, and where people couldn't really speak, is when they had, a traumatic event with the people they trusted, when they had a failure of friendship, when they had a failure in affirming friendship. So there's another also traumatic story here that also somewhat explains a bit the baggage that comes with how also Palestinians in some cases turn from a belief in resistance towards disenchantment with it, a belief in the ability of resistance to open the political possibilities towards this trauma of that is interpolated within their own subjectivity, where there's a shattering experience and where people recalibrate their own relationship to the world in a different way, or choose silence, or even choose to become completely against resistance in many instances, or work even for the forces that are against resistance. So this failure of friendship would become very interesting to me and very central to my research as well. Whether it's in providing the genesis for one of the basic social institutions of how cells were formed through this affinity with friendship, or whether also what happens when friendship fails, or when the affirmation of friendship fails, and how that leaves a big gap in people's own narrative and self-narrative, and how it ends up also explaining why some Palestinians, even though they have a nationalist history, how they became operating in security forces that now capture resistance fighters, or that torture resistance fighters now in the West Bank, for instance. So yeah, I mean, that's why I think friendship is central, and I think within Palestinian society, it's always been the case. I mean, some people would also come, and you will try to explain to somebody why a specific village is all leftist, and you can't explain it because the village next to it is all, for example, or mostly I don't know, Islamist. And then you come, what happened here socially for the these two close villages to have one a very leftist presence and the other has a more Islamist presence. And then you end up also that in large part in these small rural communities, for instance, if one person that is well respected in that society, loved, people trust, and for some reason was a leftist, then the village slowly historically became leftist when the other village, so that form of intimate relationships are always central, even for political organizing, even for how credibility is built for one political party in a certain community or a certain camp in Palestine, or why or how people coalesce around specific cells, and who's excluded also from the cell, because sometimes friends have to choose the friend that cannot be part of the cell, and that creates a lot of problems as well and headaches. And because they're doing things and that guy is close to them, but so it provides for an interesting history that also has jokes and has traumatic events and has, so we can read, I guess, Palestinian resistance through the cells. And at some point I wanted to change my dissertation to a history of cells in Palestine and not do the second and first intifada, but I was too deep into it. But yeah, I mean, there's a theoretical thing around it, but it's not necessarily, at least in terms of explaining the centrality of it. Yeah.
All right. So yeah, do you want to respond at all?
Yeah, I mean, I really like that section, learning about these areas. It was so familiar to me again, right? Like this is where I feel like I'm getting older, right? I say shit like neat. I think it's neat to learn about other areas and see, like, because my mind starts running real quick when I hear things from other contexts. I'm like, oh yeah, that sounds like this, like, and it's not one to one, but it helps me make sense of things. I think that slippery slope of the friendship building is really important for folks to think about, right? Like, because, you see that in organizing spaces, people get really close and then something happens, it's a real testy area, right? Like, if you're doing serious work, then you're being threatened, right? Like, you're a target. And so you just have a lot of shit on your mind all the time. And so any little like scratch feels like a slug, like, and people get really reactive, right? And because a lot of times in movement spaces, right, like building in a movement, it's by fire, right? Like I remember the one episode y'all did with the brother who came out after doing a bunch of time, right? And I think that episode's title is called Abolitionists by Fire, right? And so, like, in a lot of ways, right, these movements, right, like, they start, like, you just kind of develop and you're by fire, right? But the community organizing alternative stuff, right, like, I think is really important. And so, I don't know if you want me to talk about the garden stuff right now, like a little bit, or you want me to wait after some of the other clips. But I think, I thought about that specifically here when he starts to mention the kind of like falling apart, or that like some people could be part of the cells but can't, and then can't, like that part really reminded me of like the fissures that happen with these spaces in one's community, right? And how that also creates other tensions, but also openings if you got the right people around you and you've built enough, like,
Yeah,
goodwill.
I think I do want you to get that. I want to say a couple things before you do, because I think one of the things that he does, you notice in my response, I'm sort of like trying to pose it in some ways as an alternative to organization in the way that I frame the question. And he does take a second to say, sort of, that's not what I'm saying, right? Like, it's not. Uh, and I think that's an important thing. I don't want folks to miss, because it's not just like he's saying, like, it's all about friendship. If you listen to Abdul Jawad talk about a lot of other stuff, he'll also say that, for instance, some of the criticisms that he has right now within the West Bank have to do with the lack of, political social organization that is able to mobilize people that are not in cells, that are able to mobilize people who are not engaged in this, this form of resistance with, actual military, components to it, right? And so it's not, I wanna be clear to people that, again, like, and also I think this relates back to Cedric and Moten's conversation too, of like, they're talking about, in some ways, the necessary precondition and not disavowing uh the capacity of violence or the enactment of it, but also that there's all these other things that we can do, which is the propaganda war, which is also like, how do you make sure that the society as a whole, or the people who are not a part of these structures, don't also turn their back on them and support in different ways, and so on. And so there's also like, this is also where organizations are very important, but also other structures where you work in the community to try to develop these kinship ties and things like that. I mean, a lot of what he's talking about too, he talks about the villages and how they're all one, one political persuasion or another, and stuff like that. And obviously that's much deeper than just like a few individuals or whatever. There's a whole fabric of kinship and relationality there, and sociality, that I think that all of them in different ways are thinking about in their work. But yeah, talk about, how you think about that and the work you do with the garden and community stuff too. And I know you're also a part of organizations too, so it's like, it's all of these things.
Yeah. So I think, I've said this before, right? Like, to some degree, but things have advanced in different ways. The necessary precondition part is really important, like, so that folks, like, I don't expect elders in my community to take up arms in the future, when the revolution come, like, I think that'd be silly, and if they want to, they can, right? Like, but like, I don't expect kids to be out doing, whatever, right? Like, if things escalate to a point where we are like going to inaugurate and take a new world, like, that's not the expectation. But the expectation is that you understand and you trust the people who you've been building with, like, in these other social spaces, right? In this other ways, right? Like, holding space for people, for their grief, for their pains, for their traumas, for their fears, right? Like, that you trust those folks, and this sounds like, I don't know, like, this is like almost, yeah, this is abstract, right? But like, in the affective realm, right? Like, you trust those folks' hearts, right? Like, you trust them because they're here, they're your neighbors, they want another world, they're invested in a future that you have been fighting your whole life for. And so I think that's the kind of building block that is really important for community organizing, right? I think one of the things that occurs, right, like, going back to the film, right, and the petty bourgeois, right, like, or the petty bourgeois aspirations that some of our people, a lot of our folks have, right, like, they want to get ahead, and so there's this kind of desire. And so, what's interesting is that neoliberalism and non-profitization and all that stuff, right, like, has done a number on us, right, like, in terms of movement building, and everything is really market oriented and so transactional, right? And so There's very limited opportunities, and only certain sectors get that money, and and people start competing, right? And that tears at that fabric, that sociality, that friendship, those bonds, that kinship, right? Like that can be a building block for whatever, right? Like for whatever, right? Like it's not just revolutionary struggle, right? But like shifting relations, impactful reform in your community, or like meeting people's basic needs, right? Like all that shit is really important. But what that competition shit does, it creates tensions amongst different sectors or cells, if you want to call them that, right? Or different groupings or formations, right? Like, and so, one of the community gardens we worked with, right? Like I talked before, we did programming, we did summer program during the pandemic. We helped have Black and brown children, working poor children, right? Like have a summer camp during the pandemic where they were introduced to a bunch of different things, like the cycles of life and death, right? Like there was some artists that came and performed like a weird Cirque du Soleil circus type shit from Puerto Rico, just because the homies were homies with the homies, right? Like that. And they came and showed out, and they had these huge fucking puppets, and there were 3 people, whatever, and it was beautiful, right? And it's in the middle of this fucking industrial abandoned place right across the streets. In the proximity, there's all kinds of other activity going on, right? Like, but we create these little cradles, and from that cradle, right, like that relationship ended, and so we started at our house, and we ran a community garden program that was intergenerational, Black and brown, interracial, and it was really incredible, right? It was really, really incredible, right? I can't, maybe I'll write something about this, but I think that during the time that this occurred, my father was going through a lot of health issues, so I would come back, and I would just come to a home that was full of like anywhere from 20 to 30 different people, different gender expressions, different ages, different racial backgrounds, right? Different, whatever class positions, right? Different relationships to South LA, where I'm from, so on and so forth. And it wasn't this like performative shit where like everyone goes in a circle and says, whatever people say in these things, right? I don't want to say anything to fucking make folks too upset, but like, it's not like it's just people were, right? There's trans people, and then there's elders who are hella Christian. And so you have these worlds meeting, but why do they meet? To the point that was made, right? Like, it's because Alex and Susie's home has become a community hub, and whoever they're bringing in must be cool. That's a lot of responsibility to take on, right? Like, and we try to mediate those things as best we can, but we believe in that building the containers and shit, right? Like this longer struggle. So some of the things that happened that were pretty magical, I mean, I'll share one, is that there was this woman, this person in our community who was racialized different than most of us out here. They weren't white. They were a person of color, and they were walking their dog, and we're setting up outside, and we chalked the front, and we have a little bulletin board that we put out in the front of the house and shit, garden club tonight, 3 da, 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 da. And they stopped, and they were reading the messages on the sidewalk, and they looked down, and apparently they were dealing with some suicidal ideation, for folks. And they said it like stopped them in their tracks, like the colorfulness, and they went and made food and came back to bring food for the group. And then they didn't participate though, right? Like it was too much. It was overwhelming. It was too much socialization. They brought the food though, and they stayed with their dog and the cut and all this stuff. And now that person walks by our house, hasn't come back to the garden club thing, but they're alive. And they have this like little place that they can kind of like look forward to seeing whatever's growing or whatever we write on the damn sidewalk, right? Like, and that may not mean much to a lot of people, right? But it is really emblematic, at least to me, out here in a place where I talked about the cutthroat nature that is institutionalized, that like the tensions that exist amongst us intracommunally, right? Those spaces right there are few and far between strangers, right? Like we're strangers, we're neighbors, right? And so flash forward, now we've moved to another garden on another side of the neighborhood, right? Another community garden, which by the way, used to be a liquor store and a tire shop, and now was put into this like, whatever community garden. And there's this, this is on the block that I grew up. And so I'm just tripping out. Like I got shot at between that place and ran into that liquor store, and now it's a community garden. And so we just had the first meeting there a few weeks ago, and three boys, right, Black and brown boys, came in. One of them we know because it's related, and then brought his 2 best friends And I have these pictures, man, and it's just that shit is beautiful, right? Like, because these kids are digging in the dirt, they're smiling, they're about 11 years old, and that's the age where you start the hood start to harden you, you know. And then there's a space where they're like, I love it. They're planting seeds, literally, literally, right? And they're gonna see that shit develop. They made lemonade with cucumbers and shit that were brought over, and these little kids are making the lemonade for the kids. So you building this like communal nature one day every 2 weeks, but you setting foundations of like what is possible, right? And in those conversations, because we build trust and rapport and we show up and we're consistent, and if there's 2 people there or there's 30 people there, it don't matter, because we're there to serve, we're there to build these relations, and we do it with honor and like a respect for the community, for the past of the community, for the present, but really building towards the future. And I can't tell you how resonant that is with Black elders that have seen that destruction of that Black segregated community that created sociality reverts, right? Like, and come back. So we often hear, you've been the people that we were waiting for a long time. We want this back. We want da 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 da. I doubt sincerely, or my hope, my prayers, my fucking calling is that those folks won't ever turn our back if things, you know, develop or ramp up again in our community after someone is killed by the cops, right? And so we make our politics clear too, right? We don't work with the police. You can work with whoever you want, you know, but you know, we're not. And so then it doesn't even become a question, because everything is chill. So it's our little abolitionist experiment, but we don't use that word. And we harken back to the things that the people from our community already know, which is like, when we were a better community, we were more connected, right? So anyway, that's like some of the stuff like that ends up building, right? Like in the way that we thoughtfully kind of move about our everyday formations and organizations, right? Like in our community, and how it's materializing, and who knows what these years that we plan on putting this together produce, right? And yeah, I mean, I could talk about the other organizations, you know, rapid response stuff later, but I think that stuff is pertinent to this conversation, you know, and I hope it's also like it moves beyond the morose shit that we be talking about in academia, how everything is fucked up, you know, because like also resistance to the level that people do it, that's hella violent, or not violent, but like in self-defense and shit, like that shit is intimidating, you know, like I don't know how many people that listen to this shit have had guns put on their face, not because like you just got pulled over, or you were driving while Black, or driving while poor, or whatever the situation is. Yeah, that shit is terrifying. But like when you about that action, and then you standing off with these fools, and they got that look like, man, if they could, they would right now. You know, like that shit is scary. You know, I don't expect a lot of people to be about that shit. You know, like that shit is terrifying. People got families to return to, you know, and all these things. So, you know, to demystify what resistance and community building do, you know, like it don't have to be that crazy. Also, we're not nonprofit. We just do this shit with people power and community and love, right? Like, I mean, yeah, we get a little funding from here and here, but like it's piecemeal, you know, like it's nothing. Like, you know, it's donations, you know, and we expand that community through those donations and those networks, and people kind of find out what we're doing, and people want to join, and it's something, man. We just built it, you know, and like we're still building, and we're building it around that notion of connection, because we understand the world is very disconnected, and our world specifically have been ravaged by the disconnection and alienation of capitalism, of violence, of racism, of abandonment, you know, all that shit. And we saying, no, fuck that. We got each other. We got us. And then, you know, now, you know, I got to keep throwing the fucking West Coast shit on here. So, you know, just they not like us.
Right on. Yeah, I appreciate all of that, man. I think I'll respond to one of these audience questions too. So somebody asked, what's the difference between friendship in this context and revolutionary love, or are they the same? I mean, I don't know. I mean, first, yeah. I mean, I think that the way that part of what Abdul Jawad is talking about, I mean, he lays it out quite clearly, which is that as you were saying, it's scary, right, to engage in these things, and the consequences, the price to pay is high, right? And I think most of us recognize this. This is why most of us aren't doing really militant forms of action all the time, is because the price to pay for that stuff is very high. And and sometimes we internalize that even more than we should, I think, sometimes for stuff that is not, where the price for it is not as high. But I think that is something that's deeply ingrained in us. But in the Palestinian context, as he said, they know this, right? They know that it doesn't just mean that they're going to torture you. It doesn't just mean that they're going to imprison you, right? It means that they're also going to come after your family. They're also going to come after your friends, right? And so if you understand those preconditions, then who are the people that you're going to actually trust enough to work with, right? And to actually engage in something that could put you at that kind of risk. It requires a really deep form of trust. And that deep form of trust, honestly, is often, and this is the part that I think is important in what he's hinting at too, because it's not an either or in terms of organizations, but he is saying that even within the organization, right? Or even that there still sometimes would be, who do you actually trust enough to engage this kind of struggle, right? It's going to be the people where you have a deep enough foundation and relationship with them that you know that when you get snatched up or whatever else, that this person is not going to turn on you. Yeah, you're muted. Go ahead, Alex. What did you want to say?
Oh no, I'm just fucking echoing what you're saying. Like, they ain't gonna snitch on me, right? Like, and so that question, I think it is important, right? Like, but like, love is transcendent, like, and again, not to get all like, in that realm, right? Like, but it is a transcendent thing. And so, like, to your point and to the point that the brother made, right, which is like, to develop that trust, you gotta know, like, you gotta check in with folks. You gotta like see them. Like, if I see you down, Jared, I'm gonna be like, hey, what's up, bro? Everything all right, man? I seen da 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 da. Like, I want to know when you're down, like, I want to know when you up. Like, I want to know when people are those things, so I can get a sense of that trust, right? Of that holistic person in front of me, right? Like, and not because I'm trying to get something out of you, because I'm showing you I'm there, right? Like, I'm performing the thing that I want you to perform for me, right? Like, I'm modeling it for you. And for a lot of us, we don't know that, like, especially in these communities. So like, it overextends, right? I can't imagine in the Palestinian context after so many Palestinian men have been taken, right, like, out of their communities, like, kidnapped into the hellholes that are the fucking gulags of fucking Israel, right, or the Zionist entity and shit. You know what I mean? Like, that shit is here. When he talked about this shit, I'm sorry, like, because that shit is the other part that I thought was really important. When he talked about the surveillance of, like, when they kill your homies over there, I was like, bro, like, when gang members get killed out here, right, like, they get hella surveilled. Like, it is so dangerous when there's a gang-involved shooting out here, right? And that's what who's your homies? Where you stay at, right? So that question, going back to the Kendrick Good Kid, Mad City album, right? Like, that section is so important, right? Like, it's so indicative. That section in, I think it's the intro before Money Trees, right? Which was performed last night on that thing, which is like, when they check in for who came into the neighborhood, right? Like, that deep level of sociality, who are you? That's beyond neighborhood watch shit, right? Like, that's not the logic. This is like, are you of us, or are you of some other side? And how do I find that out? Where your mama stay, where your grandma stay, where your daddy stay? Like, you got to tell me somebody stay here, And that may not make sense to everybody, especially like the Western imagination that feels like, like, carries people. They feel like they should belong anywhere and everywhere. They should be invited to any space because they have a good heart. That's not how that works. You gotta like give, right? Like, you have to like you have to show a link, a connection, right? And so that kind of stuff is really important, I think. And there's so many translatable things to what the wretched of South Central face, or the wretched of whatever, right? Like, to the global South, right? And I think the notions of the internal colonies are still very real. And we face those things, and we face them together, right, in a lot of ways, right? Like, we don't get abandoned. This is why, like, when there's a police shooting, shit gets active in the community, because we ready, as long as there's organizers and people to kind of activate and connect, then people, they will respond, especially in the last 5-6 years, like, with everything that's gone on. So anyway, those are some things that I thought, as as we continue to talk about that clip, because I think it's it's important.
Yeah, and I'm just gonna bridge it too, because this may seem also like a disjointed thing, what I'm about to do in terms of some of the shifts to the second half of sort of videos and stuff that I want to play. And I just want to make some of the connections for folks that were striking to me at this conference. Um, and because I do think I do want to be clear, like I think most academic conferences are a bunch of bullshit, basically. And even ones that I think are fairly good and there's some good political stuff going on, like there's not a lot of depth there in terms of like the sociality, relationality, like radical connections being made, organizational possibilities. It's just usually not there. And I mean, we talked about this a little bit in our reflections from the abolition conference too. And I did feel a little bit differently in terms of the Robinson conference, just in terms of like how people were. And you were talking about people being uh I don't remember if you were talking about it in the community garden space, but it's connected to that too. Of like, I don't think you were at Elizabeth Robinson's house that night, but it was incredible. I mean, she just had like 80 people over, and everybody was just themselves and just having conversations. But people are doing really engaged radical work on their campuses and in their communities and stuff like that. And so like the things that they had to talk about were just different than what you traditionally see within academics. And part of that is the space that Cedric and Elizabeth opened up, which was their home, which was their backyard. And so as I make this connection, part of what I'm doing here is I'm going to go to this panel, which was a panel that on its surface was about the 20th anniversary of the 20-year Cedric Robinson conference. So people would be like, I mean, it was kind of one where you might think, oh, this might be one I could skip or whatever, just in theory, right? But like, and I'm only gonna play clips of it, and I do feel like people should watch the whole thing, but I also feel like even watching it in video, you won't really get the full experience of it, because what it was really about on the whole was, these women and these folks just like really performing a kind of care work with each other, but also reflecting on the things that enabled them to exist and subsist in what was really a very violent and antagonistic environment to them. And it's a lot of um, the stuff that we've already been talking about. And again, like I know that this is a couple of steps removed. Now we're talking about it in an academic space, and I don't want to like I never want people to think, especially on this platform, that I think that the revolution is going to come from the academy, or that the academics are the one that's going to lead it. And I don't believe that at all. But I still think that there's lessons that can be derived from this, and I do have a deep respect for these people. I mean, again, like when I met the people that were a part of this panel, in particular, HLT Kwan and Tiffany Willoughby-Herard, like they didn't know who I was at all. I was just some random person who came into the space, and they're like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "I'm a podcaster," which, like, I mean, most people would just laugh at you and like go like, "Oh, okay, what do you podcast about?" But like they were actually really interested, which is weird to me. Like it's not the normal. Anyway, that's all aside. But I'm gonna play first, just so people are reminded of who Tiffany Willoughby-Herard is. They went viral recently, and you will probably recognize this clip. So hang on one second.
Faculty member. I'm a tenured professor. They're destroying the campus and undoing a democratic, peaceful protest. Shame on them. Shame on them. What department are you in? I'm in the Global Studies Department. And why are you here today? Because we cannot have a genocidal foreign policy in a democracy. These young people are going to be the ones that have to pay the price for these horrible decisions. These police officers out here today, that's thousands of student scholarships. Thousands of students could have been able to go to school and have books and have housing. But instead, our chancellor, who is a very cruel man, decided to send thousands of dollars worth of state funding paid for by the taxpayers into the trash. Are you concerned about this jeopardizing your job? For real. What job do I have if the students don't have a future?
Hello, I'm Mark.
So, I mean, first of all, this incredible clip. And yeah, so I just wanted people to have context because I'm going to play then part, and we could talk about that part later too if we want. Great example of a professor, being militant in truth speaking and standing up for their students. But before I'm going to play a little clip from Tiffany next. I just wanted people to make that connection of, this is who this person is. So yeah. Let's see this one.
I think I'll start with the question about the role of education and radical movement research for today and tomorrow, because what epistemicide looked like for me as a graduate student here was like having come from an elite undergraduate, an elite high school education, and really, really thinking I was very, very prepared and not understanding how political it was to be a Black person trying to earn a PhD. In fact, I remember one time after you finished, can I tell that story? Dr. Cromer said, they let such and such get a PhD. And I didn't come here with the understanding that that was actually, that it was really such a big deal. And I think it's because, like, even though I was from Black Detroit, there was just such an emphasis on the possibility of an educational journey. Um, like crack, like deindustrialization, like everything that could possibly happen, like failed attempts at internal colony, and still every single year my church had a graduation ceremony, and they'd give you a brand new Bible, and there would always be somebody, like two or three somebodies who were in their 70s who had just earned their bachelor's degree or their master's degree. And so coming here and having people not like understand that it was a normative thing for me to pursue education was really, really hard. So I had to really reach far, far, far beyond the classroom because I would finish taking a major comprehensive examination, and then the faculty member of color who was in the room would be like, that's the best essay I've ever read, and that's so amazing. And then I would get a letter saying I'd failed. And that happened over and over and over and over and over again until I wrote that same comprehensive exam and said Africa is best known for disease, famine, ugliness, and foolishness. And then all of a sudden it was a pass. Um, so that's what epistemicide looks like. It looks like not expecting you to be in the room, constantly telling you you have no capacity to be in the room, and whatever it is that you might have known beforehand doesn't have any value whatsoever, and then rewarding you when you say nonsense. Um, so I start there because this weekend I am learning about all the different kinds of ways that Elizabeth and Cedric built infrastructure so that I could survive. Because one of the things I was going to talk about was the way that public research universities put professors in a position where they can't actually defend their students. That was actually going to talk about that. But then I learned that, from looking at the archival materials, that Cedric had participated in a hunger strike, and Cedric had organized with other people and knew how to use the apparatus of the governance structure of the UC system to be able to confront administrators who were not in service to the state mandate of the UC system. And I didn't know those things. And yet, I mean, these are people who've been in my life um, for 30 years. For 30 years. Okay, so what do I want to say about the role of education and radical movement research for today and tomorrow? The most simple thing is it is my read of this moment that they do not mean for us to have access to anything like collective education any place in the US as very, very soon. And so, what I'm always trying to tell my own students is something about the responsibility to learn these techniques of how to talk to people and how to listen to people so that they'll be able to um, carry on some tiny remnant or residue of a vision of an egalitarian world, right? And that a lot of that for me was not just modeled at the Robinsons kitchen table, um, but it was told to me directly when I would take my like little wounded self and show up at the radio station, you know, in Stork Tower and describe some really demeaning thing that had happened in a graduate seminar or some humiliating thing that had happened on the hallway and the floor of the department. And Elizabeth would say, "You have to fight back." And that wasn't easy to hear. It wasn't easy to hear because I knew that it might mean that I could be risking the opportunity to get an education. You know, it might mean some other kinds of things. But the constant reminder that I had to fight back, that there was no politeness, respectability, there was no soft sotto voce, there was no way I could do my hair, there was nothing that I could do that was going to make it possible for me to survive here other than telling people, fuck you, and I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere, and I have a right to be here, and I'm going to claim this education, even if I have to steal it, even if I have to go to war with you in order to get this education. Um, so that message about being told to fight back and being told to stand up for myself over and over and over again, even when I didn't want to hear it, is kind of one of.
All right, right on. So I want to play that part. Again, like I do encourage people to listen to this whole panel, but for time's sake, I'm gonna jump now to one other clip from the panel from Francois Cromer that I really appreciated as well. And before play this, I should say this is at the end. So she's just concluded her comments, which were great, right? And HLT Quan says something like, you have a minute and a half left. And so you get this last closing story that I don't think Francois initially meant to be a part of her discussion, but I thought in many ways it was sort of I'll just say it was my favorite part of the presentation, although the whole thing was really good too.
And of course, I just want to say thank you to Elizabeth. Thank you to all of you up here. And I will pass the mic to HQ. I still have a minute and a half. Okay, so what's another story I can tell? Working at KCSB with Elizabeth. Elizabeth, and I worked with Elizabeth on the media archive. So it was all of Third World News Review. It was their work on No Alibis at KCSB. And of course, hanging around Elizabeth, I started my own KCSB program. And I believe Lady J still keeps it alive today. That's Fire Upon Rome. Y'all know Anthony B. Reggae. That's those papal bulls that Dr. Pigeon was teaching us about in the classroom, but we said fire upon Rome, right? And that's the Nyabingi, burn down Rome, just like we had to burn down those sugar plantations. And, Nanny and others throughout the diaspora moved up into the maroon communities as their retreat. And, Cedric really asked, with all the Black movements that he looked at in Black Marxism, why wasn't there a more violent response, especially since that's the way, we were being viewed at the time, the descendants of the kidnapped Africans brought throughout the diaspora. And he looked at Nat Turner, who had a, quote unquote, successful insurrection. He organized it, and he, used the stars and cosmologics, all of this mythology and those Pan-African, based on African religions, like Tiffany and, the undergraduate students, folks going up in the Black Studies department with candles and incense and prayer. But anyway, that is the Black radical tradition, right, in practice. But even with all of that, he had a very successful insurrection, and it's the consciousness, that develops, where you even had descendants of Africans putting their arms into cannons that would blow up. And how do you get that strength and that bravery? And to me, my experience is that you find a peace within you, and you find a community um, that is your support, and who are what we would say ride or die for you, where at the drop of a dime you can call them and they're there. Um, that when you find that peace within yourself, that's the freedom from fear, and the freedom to stand up to anything, anything. You visualize the outcome that you want, and we work with you metaphysically, cosmologically, in that place of peace, to make that vision a reality. And so, thank you. Thank you.
I was muted. All right. So that's it for the clips. And so we'll close out with some discussion. We can take questions from the audience too. I'm sure we both have thoughts that we want to share based off of all of that as well. And again, like I feel I had longer clips too, but I was like, we're already, I timed it all out, right? And I'm like, we're already at an hour and 38 minutes. And I knew that as I was like, because I kind of prepped it out. And so there's other parts of those discussions that I would have loved to include, including commentary from HLT Kwan, including more of what both Tiffany and Francoise had to say, including what some of the other folks that including the moderators and whatnot, like there's a relationality that's there between these folks through shared experience, through shared institutional violence enacted upon them, and through the ways that they supported each other, defended each other, showed up for each other, that doesn't fully come through watching it as on video, but doesn't fully come through even more through showing segments of it. But that piece, one of the things I had DM'd Alex this as we were talking, like I wrote this piece on abolition and spirituality a few years ago, and in a few minutes there, she actually better articulates it than I was ever able to quite get to, because I was really interested in the cosmological. I was really interested in the spiritual, and how did this enable people to stick their arms into cannons and, stuff. It was both of us are drawing upon Cedric's work, and I was in my piece as well. But like her point about that that's not where it actually starts. Like the cosmological and the spiritual are things that you do for each other when there's already these conditions of deep relationality, kinship, friendship, this deep dedication. And those are part of the ways that you find peace in order to do the things that are necessary to do, right? And I didn't get there, and so I appreciate her naming that. And to give context, like, they were joking about certain stuff, but Tiffany had talked about how when they were a grad student, that they used to go and pray in front of all the professors' doors because there must be something wrong with them, that needed to be kind of either cleansed or fixed or whatever. And Tiffany shared that they ran into an undergrad student who told Tiffany that they had a like a women's prayer circle from a church that would come and like burn incense and say prayers in the poli-sci department. So a lot of this actually had to do with the violence of political science at UCSB, which we can imagine, right? Because again, the discussion of epistemicide right at the beginning, the way that the Western Academy wants to deny any possibility or agency or value to political thought that is outside of this manufactured Western tradition, and that's part of what Cedric was always trying to battle with. But also, he created space through his work, which was something I could really see more clearly at the conference, for all these other people to continue on in that kind of project in different ways. And so anyways, yeah, go ahead, Alex. What did you want to say?
Oh, I wrote to Jared also right now. Like, it's nice to revisit this, and the Dr. Willoughby-Herard, right? Like, when they talked about that feeling of like the violence of going to these institutions, right? I didn't really feel it by the time I got into grad school. I was like, man, fuck all this. Like, these fools are talking about people like me, like, and I got my own voice, and so by that time I had already disavowed myself. For me, it was undergrad because I was first generation, right? Like, in my class background was probably a little distinct. And so that violence was really weird, right? Like, I want to be a mathematician, man, and nobody trying to help the cholo, like, in the study groups, and that shit was real alienating, and I think that was like the first wound for me that made me fucking detest academia on a personal level, right? It was like, this is not a place that I'm gonna be accepted, and I'm not gonna bend for this shit. So, and anybody that knows me, like, knows, I don't really bend on shit, like certain things, right? Like, I don't do that respectability shit. I code switch like everybody has to, in this Western world. But that really took me back, because I was able to, the way that I got out of those wounds was through building relations with different folks, from different backgrounds. And I went to school during 9/11, like, so learning from Muslims, learning about Palestine back then, under fire, was like, oh, they ain't about to do that. Nah, fuck that. Like, I couldn't, it didn't, it didn't make sense to me that this could continue like this. And I wasn't going to do nothing about it. Like, I just was like, all right, we got to do something about it. We can't let these folks, get assaulted, and whatever. Right. So then the fight was already in me. Right. But like, that shit wears you down, like you said something earlier, it wears you down. And so, over time, as I've aged, and built better relations, right? Like, my relations have been refined, over time, through experience, through loss, through my own personal shortcomings, through the shortcomings of others, so I've learned to take stock of those things. And so to be surrounded in a space, an intellectual space like that conference, right? Like, I still feel uncomfortable, right? Like, I still don't like a lot of these things. Like, I don't enjoy it at all, actually. But once I get a chance to reflect with compas, with homies, like Jared or, Stephen Osuna or David Chavez or any of the other homies that I got, Gabriela Valenzuela, shout out to her. She just got a gig at USC. you know, all these different folks, you know, then I get this rekindling of remembrance of why I'm here, and like I get to recalibrate what my role is, right? So one thing that was really touching about that conference and even just this exchange and this particular panel was that, right? I didn't know a lot of folks at the dinner, and you know, I had to get home. I got caretaking duties and stuff, so I didn't get a chance to go to that. But like that was really beautiful, you know, and it was really affirming, because this is what me and my partner are trying to build, you know, like opening up our space and to make, you know, as you express, right, like with the work of Cedric Robinson, right, like and not just the work that he wrote down, but the work of being, right, like what everyone was talking about this person. And I've heard Stephen Osuna, you know, speak about him very highly, you know, and in a very like very respectful and dignified manner. And so I had that sense already. And so to see the kind of branches, right, develop into new trees with new branches, right, like, because I know that's what's happening. It was really affirming, because I have my little branches now, you know, and I come from other branches. You know, Dylan comes, you know, Dylan Rodriguez was on my committee, you know, like he's my people, he's good people, you know, and he gave me words that I didn't have necessarily to understand certain things, right? And so now I'm, you know, I have my students out in the world doing the things, right, and having the same challenges. So like one thing I'm reflecting on right now is like, how do you build that relationship where like you also like, you know, it's like a big deal, like when you're a mentor, whatever they call it, right? Like an advisor, like this person who has done something that other people are coming behind trying to do also, right? It's like a big responsibility or a big charge. And so I don't want to, like, I don't want to displace my own like kind of antagonisms towards the academy to students and shit. You know what I mean? And so I see some of them struggling, and they have their own kind of similar to what the relative was talking about, right? Like you get into these programs and you get treated like shit. But we prepare them to like fight, basically, right? Like in the space when we have them. And so then that fight becomes, you know, like it's just exhausting. And you just, at the end of the day, you're just trying to get this degree to get hopefully a job and provide for your family. You know, like it's just, you know, it's kind of like straightforward for first gen working class people, right? Like, and then you do the other good stuff, you know, you want to do good stuff through that, but it becomes really challenging because it's a vex space, right? What you're asked to produce is exactly what was said, which is like nonsense, right? And I'll end the comment of that, right? Like where the resistance for me, right, like has become more and more powerful in academia, because I got people who have my back. You know, I have my students, but I also have other people who have my back, who have had my back, who have allowed me to be this person, or to continue to develop professionally to be this person, right? I was at another conference in another country last week, and it was very much the ones that like Jared was talking about. You know, I went initially to support one of my students who was supposed to present, right? Like one of my former students was getting their doctoral degree, and then another student who is doing something else. They actually presented on, you know, shout out to Carlos Somoza and Paula Ayala. Carlos, you know, presented on hip hop in Central America and rhizomes and all kinds of really wonderful stuff. And it was cool to see, you know, so I was trying to do the networking thing and introduce and, you know, do all that stuff. Like, and so, but I went to this one talk, and, you know, this is not like specific about the researcher, you know, I'm sure the research was sound. I'm sure they followed all the protocols necessary when dealing with vulnerable populations, right? Like they interviewed migrants from Central America and Monterrey, Mexico, and then TJ, and then they kind of did this comparative analysis on like there's some policies and some paperwork and documentation that you can get when you're irregular to regularize to kind of like become authorized to be in Mexico and blah, 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 all those things that people read about, right? But at the end, right, like the sample size was about 30 people, 18 in one location, 12 in another. And then the conclusions were basically like, turns out these people want to like live. I mean, it wasn't that, right? It was like these policies, they use this. But I'm like, at the end of the day, right, like what I heard was like, shit, these people are just like you and me. They'll do anything for their family and they'll do anything to survive, right? And I'm like, fuck, man, like this research could have gone some other place, right? And if I'm an advisor, I say, hey, man, how do you make the things that make their lives a little easier to navigate the conditions? Like, can we develop a way, like with the work, to make those more accessible and available to the people who need them, right? Like it shouldn't be a need to know, like, oh, I know because someone told me, right? So maybe that could be the work, but it's not, right? And it goes back to that antagonism, right? Like that kind of vexed place, right? Like where academia continues and academic research, no matter how like helpful it attempts to be, is still like premises this idea that like these people, whatever these people are, right, like somehow are different, right, like are other than like regular people, right? Like regular people love their family, regular people go to work and struggle to bring home the bacon or fucking, you know, put a roof over your head. Regular people do that. Turns out the wretched of Central America also do the same. And if there's a fucking piece of paper that you can get at a government office that maybe might protect you from an ass beating or a kid getting snatched up away by a Mexican cop, I'm gonna go get that paper. Right? Like, just like Jared would do the same thing, just like I would do for my children, right? Like, so, you know, sometimes it gets really disenchanting, right? Like, I mean, oftentimes, but like now I've been able to navigate like the distancing because like I distance myself from certain kind of like components of academia, right? My dog doesn't like it. And then I align myself with the things that I do like in academia, right? And so I do like the intellectual kind of exchange. I like to think about thinking, right? Like I like to think about how the thinking can be materialized into action. And I like to contribute my little grains of sand from my experience and my analytical frameworks, right? Like to other folks, because I refuse to let these motherfuckers tell me that my people don't got fucking shit to say, that my people don't got analysis, that my people don't have dreams, hopes, and fucking aspirations, struggles, and pains. Like, I refuse to be like think like that. You know what I mean? And so I invite my students and people whoever the fuck wants to listen, tell me your story. You know, I'm not gonna write it down. Just tell me, you know, tell me about you. Like, you know, what do you want to see change? You know, like what have you changed in your life? You know, I start off every class with think about, you know, my grad classes. Who are you accountable to in this class? Or what are you accountable to in this class? And that's a really crazy question to ask. You know, it's a wild question because people are like, what is I don't know. Right. So I'm accountable to a future. I'm accountable to a past, and I'm here in the present. You know what I mean? And that to me is like how I kind of move about the world, you know? And I'm fortunate, you know, like it was really touching to see the ways that folks were talking about Elizabeth and Cedric. You know, it was really beautiful. And there was a moment where I want to introduce myself to another faculty member after a talk. And, you know, I said, you know, I know maybe you don't know me, but I just want to let you know, somebody DM'd me and gave me some feedback on how to write my tenure portfolio thing, like randomly. And this is like a bigger name, like scholar and stuff. And I was just like dumbfounded. I was like, who the fuck? I'm not nobody. Like, I'm just this random fucking profile picture on this internet streets, right? And so because they gave me this insight a few years ago randomly, I just decided to tell them that I had just gotten tenure. And so I was like, you know, I want to thank you because, you know, you ain't have to tell me anything, but it was really impactful in how I framed my thing. And then they said, are you kidding me? I know who you are. You're like a legend at mentoring and like supporting students. Like, I've had so many of your students and they talk about you in this way. And like, man, I almost fucking shed these thug tears right there on the spot, you know? And it was the ways that folks was talking about Elizabeth and Cedric, right? And so to me, that's the kind of shit that matters to me. It ain't never gonna be citations and shit. It's like, how do I build possibilities moving forward? And I think that is part of the Black radical tradition. And how do I make space for like all of it? Because I don't have a path to fucking, if I did, we would have been free collectively. You know, I'm just a fucking regular person, you know, at the end of the day. And I'm trying to collect a bunch of regular people to fucking, hopefully we can do some irregular shit or some outlandish shit. Like Jared, you know, wrote on like that circle back, dog. That was fucking right there.
Appreciate it. Couple comments. In Britain, they are threatening to deport students who have been protesting for Gaza, Palestine. That's happening all over, Harvey. So I just want to just say yes, like this is happening in the United States too. Absolutely. Especially because they know a lot of the students are Arab students, Palestinians, you know, international students who are making these connections, who already understand and are most committed often to these struggles. They will use that as the leverage of yeah, we can kick you out of here and we can deport you. You can lose not just your education, but your housing, your food, and be deported, sent right back, and so this is absolutely happening. And I want to say that too, just to be clear too, because the academies, we're not saying this at all to be, in fact, prior to this conference, one of the things that I probably would have said it right now is that you see all the contradictions of the academy on full display right now, and I'm totally fine with it all getting burned down. Fuck it, like let it go. Like that's kind of been my mentality, honestly. And it still is to like some extent. But part of what I did see in this was like also within this are these other communities who are doing really radical work, who have archives that need to be defended and protected, who have built connections and like can come from a small place like UCSB and have this really big blueprint around the country and all these universities. And they're the people, and this is part of why I also wanted to make sure to include Tiffany Willoughby-Herard, because you see the lengths that they are willing to go to, right, to stand up for their students. And there's not, I mean, there are more and more professors who are willing to do that. You talked about on your own campus feeling better because of like the people who are around you and the folks, and so I think like that's the part, is that it is still, even if it is a capitalist space, a bourgeois space, if it is in participating in epistemicide, and if it is funding the military industrial complex and doing research for it and everything else, we have to try to obviously contest all of those things, divesting all of these struggles. But like, it did give me a more nuanced thing of like, okay, I don't actually want all of these people to be without a job or without ability to impact students and connect with them. And I recognize that that could happen outside of the academy, but it would be a lot more difficult. And I know it does already as well. So I was thinking about that. Chidimacha's comment about having to fight back constantly is utterly exhausting. Absolutely. And you could see that in that panel too. There was a lot of like them just doing kind of like HLT Kwan actually referred to the panel itself as a form of restorative justice for the violence that had been enacted upon them in the university for all those years. And just did so in a way of like also, like fuck these places, and poli-sci is terrible, and like, just talking about, so there was all of that going on as well. The term epistemicide, yeah, I think this is really good. And I actually I'm hoping that at some point Dr. Willoughby-Herard will come on the show. They wrote this great book that's called Waste of a White Skin, which is about racial regimes and white people in South Africa. And I'm really interested. And I think the Carnegie Foundation. And so I want to read that book and hopefully get a chance to talk to them about it and talk to them more. And then this kind of friendship is constantly being targeted by systems of power. They don't want relationships like these to happen. And that's the point, right? That's part of what I'm saying too, in terms of like like, it's not that you're defending the university, like fuck the university, but like, how do you defend those radical kinship networks and the radical capacity of intellectual work, which we do deeply need with our movements as well. So that's part of it also. You want to say anything else, Alex, in closing?
Yo, Jared, you fucking nailed it. I mean, that is a great analysis of like, there is these places of respite. They're not a given in these places. And I think that more of us, to the person who wrote that resisting or fighting back is utterly exhausting, you're fucking 100% like right. And this is why you got to build cadres and cells in academia, and anything that you do, you have to think about like, I got to find my people, like I got to like build those relationships, because that way you don't have to fight alone. And that's the thing that like gets really, socializing this shit, like that you're alone, that you're individual, you achieve these ranks, you get an award, You know, I think the more that folks continue to cheer themselves, cheer their comrades on, like celebrate their victories in whatever space. This we're talking about academia right now. We're gonna be better for it. We disrupt the capitalist like logics that continue to permeate and animate our entire existence on this planet, right? Like especially in the West. And so, I just think, fuck, make friends. You know what I mean? Like make fucking friends, like be down with somebody, like and make friends around politics, make friends around like your visions of how you love or how you care or how you enact that care, you know what I mean? Or like shared, even commiserating, like, you know what I mean? There's so many ways to build really deep connections and get to know people and get to know what they value, that go beyond, like a fucking speed dating profile, right? It's just kind of like a fucking, you build it through these relationships, and it's an incubator. It's an incubator, these grad programs and things, right? So use it, you know what I mean? Like use it, don't let it incubate you into something else, and so it is beautiful to see that, and I'm grateful that I've met Jared. I'm grateful to all the compas, that I've met through all of this, because they keep pushing me and inspiring me to think about how to sharpen my own kind of ways of thinking and being, but also like how to reach more folks, like how to engage and come out of the shell of South Central, you know what I mean? Like, cause I'm not just a South Central kid, like, I mean, I am, but like it goes beyond that. And I think that I want to learn. And so, in my belief is that I want to share too, you know what I mean? So like, it's always pushing back against that. So this is why I share my little, provincial ass story with folks, because I want to hear your provincial ass story so we can kind of map these enemies together, and then I think that's really important work that we could do as academics and intellectuals. So thanks,
Right
Jared.
on.
Appreciate you, bro.
Yeah, I know you got to get out of here. I appreciate it so much. Yeah, I'm gonna say a couple words in closing, but I'll let you uh, exit stage left. So appreciate it so much, Alex. Always good to be in conversation with you. All right. So that's pretty much it. I want to say a couple things in closing too about just that point about the university. I mean, like, so I think it was Noah Tesfaye who was out there with us, and hopefully we'll have Noah on soon for one of these reflections too. But asked Stefano Harney if there was one aspect of the undercommons that he would change. And this is something that if people followed Moten and Harney, they probably have heard them say elsewhere. But there was this essay that was the oldest essay, which was about the university, and it gave people a notion that when they were talking about the undercommons, that there was something specific about the university that they were talking about. And you know that's not what they were saying, right? It wasn't just the university, right? It could have been Ford Motor Company. It could be, you know, the shitty nonprofit that we've worked for, or um whatever other space of employment, right? Is that place is going to be a part of the capitalist system. It's going to be a part of the you know this Western mythology culture, right? That is the epistemicide, right? Um, and within that, you got to find the spaces, the cracks, right? The places where you can do that radical study together, where you can form those radical bonds and relationships, right? And it's nothing specific about the university. So if you're in the university, obviously you need to be doing that, but wherever you're at, you need to be doing that as well. And I do want to just say, of course, join organizations, um, you know, join in movements that are going on, join in, there's obviously a lot going on. And I know a lot of people are engaged in a number of ways around Palestine right now and continue to do that. But hopefully this just, is a way of kind of helping us think about some things today that, may be helpful or provide us some kind of fortitude as we move forward in that fight. And I'll leave it there. I'll see you hopefully on Monday. We're going to talk to HLT Quan about a bunch of Cedric Robinson's work, and I'm really looking forward to that because I don't think there's anybody who's engaged as much with Cedric's written work and thought as HLT Quan has. And so other than Elizabeth Robinson. And that's one note I do have to make before I go to, is that, um, you know, we shouldn't treat Elizabeth's legacy as secondary to Cedric's or just sort of supplemental to it. And I think it's easy to kind of do that, because he's the one with all the published work. But seeing the reflections that week and meeting her, and like, Elizabeth might be Mouse, right? And Cedric might be Odell in that kind of metaphor. She might be the Mouse Force. And they talked about KCSB, which is the radio station on the university public access TV that she and Cedric engaged for a really long time. You also noticed that multiple of them, and if you listen to all the conversations, you'll hear more and more of this, is that Elizabeth was the one who taught them how to fight or told them that they had to fight, right? And also that both Cedric and Elizabeth, and HQ mentions this in her piece of the discussion, but they were the ones who said it's not enough to just critique media, right? We have to actually create our own too. And I think that comment that Cedric made about the propaganda war, I don't think we won the propaganda war with regard to Iraq. Like, I think it's just lost. Like, people still look back and try to add, I mean, maybe to some degree, but the war did go on for the 15 years plus that he imagined. Although, yeah, anyways, more and more, especially with Afghanistan too, right? It went on and on and on. And they didn't win, US didn't win those wars in some decisive, victory that aligned those, regimes fully with what the United States wanted. But they did an incredible amount of damage. And so that's the importance of the propaganda war. And I think that on some level we are doing better around that with Palestine right now than we did with Iraq. And I think that's a result of a lot of organizing, a lot of work by Palestinians, outlets like Electronic Intifada, Mondo Weiss, others. But I also think that you see it, right? You see it reflected in the number of people who are getting engaged, who are resisting, who I think there's still like polling numbers on who actually supports the Palestinian resistance are mixed, but there's like, I think it's something like 25% of the American populace recognizes the right of Palestinians to resist, the Zionist entity, right? Something like that. And like, you could say, okay, well, that's not a majority of people. You're talking about millions and millions of people, right, who recognize that. And that is a huge, I think it was Joe Emmersberger who made the point of like, if you just organize that population, what could you do with that, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I think that there are ways that we constantly need to fight that propaganda war, and Cedric reminds us of that. And Elizabeth and Cedric give examples of how to do that through their own media work. And so I'm reminded of that as well. And I will leave it there. Thank you, everybody.